Hello everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw The Nun 2 once again take the number one spot against the new Poirot film of A Haunting in Venice, with a very, very close 1-2 punch. 14.7 million being projected for The Nun 2, whereas A Haunting in Venice is projected at 14.5. So it'll be interesting to see once the actual numbers come out on Monday or Tuesday, which film ultimately will end up being the winner in those actuals, but still, nonetheless, not a good start, not a good sign for A Haunting in Venice as far as the box office is concerned. We also have a pretty major update to one film we have not really talked about in great detail in quite a while, and that is Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Still a terrible title for a movie because it's just so darn long. So Mission Impossible 7, and that news is the fact that the film, no thank you Cinema Blend, has actually reached a settlement with an insurance provider because of all the delays that it had to go through with COVID. They have actually gotten $71 million coming out from that lawsuit. It goes on to say that it's again it's connected to the COVID-19 production delays. The insurance company Chubb's previous payout of $5.5 million was way below the $100 million limit that the policy insuring Mission Impossible 7. Now the settlement reportedly agreed upon after the case was concluded in the middle of 2022 has been revealed, and again around $71 million. So very, very impressive for that, and it does change the game a little bit when it comes to that film's overall profit. So we'll talk about that as well. Before we enter any further though, please make sure you smash that like button, loud the fire button, Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time your video or live stream goes live on the channel. So The Nun 2, as Tony over at Deadline, good old Tony, gotta love his fear comments here. Nun 2 scares off Poirot to become Mother Superior of a box office. Oh goodness, Tony, your puns are just never ending. It goes on to say, it looks like Hercule Poirot doesn't have a prayer at winning the box office this weekend, with Kenneth Branagh as A Haunting in Venice losing the number one spot to second place weekend of New Line Cinema's Nun 2, and again, that's 14.7 in the first place, 14.5 for second place. That's in line with the industry estimates, which show a 100,000 to 300,000 lead for Nun 2 over the Disney 20th Century Studios film. If these numbers stick into tomorrow, it's not a tie, as others are labeling it Nun 2 wins. So, okay, very silly words there at the very end for Tony, but I do have to ultimately agree with them. A win is a win. There is no way around it, right? If your number is higher than the other number, that on paper automatically means, guess what? You made more money, which means in the number one and number two spot, you gotta go 1-2. There's no tie unless somehow, some way in the actuals they made the exact same amount of money, which just doesn't sound quite mathematically possible, though I guess probable would be the better word there, I guess, because I'll have someone who's an expert in math trying to say, well, actually, if you hold these equations and and I'll be like, okay, yeah, sure. You go ahead and make that argument. But regardless of that, very, very impressive numbers here. It goes on to talk about, though, how even though A Haunting in Venice had PLFs, meaning the premium format screens, and IMAX, which propelled 36% of its weekend, so 36% of the tickets sold for this movie for opening weekend went to IMAX, or it came from IMAX and any other premium formatted screens. The Nun 2 had a better Saturday than the Branagh film, 6.25 million versus 5.4 million. The sequel's overall hold this weekend is 55%, which is great for a horror pick. They typically drop around 60% or worse in weekend number 2. So that's a very good point as well. It's still high though, right? So basically when we talk about whether it be Marvel films or in many cases horror films, they tend to have a very strong opening weekend. People want to find out what is going on in that film. If there's a twist, they want to find out right away before anything is spoiled. So it makes a lot of sense that you would have a much higher upfront opening weekend and then a bigger drop off by weekend number 2. So still very impressive, but again, 55% is still quite a high percentage drop there. So again, very interesting topic there and very interesting numbers. Going to the actual charting over at thenumbers.com, as you can see, The Nun 2 being in that 55% drop off situation still made around $14.7 million. And again, that is still a $3,900 per screen ratio, which is not as good as the newcomer Haunting in Venice's $4,300 screen ratio. But again, we're talking here about very, very close movies. Not a whole lot separating them both, but also still a very large percentage drop-off for The Nun 2. Right now, The Nun 2's total domestic has gone up to 56.5 million. They also added 15 screens. So again, Impressive numbers there for a horror film, but as far as a general film goes, it's still a pretty high percentage drop. Haunting in Venice not really having that strong of an opening weekend, right? The fact that The Nun 2 has been out for 2 weeks has already gotten to 56.5. You're talking about Haunting in Venice maybe being able to get in the 30s range, right? The 20s, 30s range by next weekend. So not nearly as strong of a performer as The Nun 2. And when you compare the budgets of those two movies, with the Haunting in Venice film costing almost twice as much, it kind of goes to show you as to why The Nun 2 is being able to already make profits, whereas Haunting in Venice likely will not make any profit, will likely be another box office flop, and I can't really say I'm all that surprised. I know that there are people out there that have actually come back talking about the movie, saying that it wasn't actually that bad, that it was actually quite entertaining, that they actually thought it was even the best of the entire franchise because they liked some of the horror elements that were in the actual film itself. I think Jeremy Johns gave it a somewhat positive review, that it's a good time, no alcohol required. I think that was his score for it. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section. But someone that I really trust, one of my mods on the channel, the Modern Major General herself, was a very much like this movie. So it's definitely made me interested and intrigued in it. But I think I've just been so burned on the franchise, because the first film was better than it should have been, and I genuinely enjoyed it. But then the second film, I went in with higher expectations because of that, and then it ended up being just a giant disappointment with just a terrible ending. And so I really just have no desire, not to mention 20th Century Studios and their marketing for this movie market it as a horror film. And knowing that this is an Agatha Christie adaptation, and they've obviously taken some liberties with the adaptation, as they tend to do with most adaptations these days, I look at this and I think to myself, okay, to me, 20th Century Studios' mind, they were like, hey, we need to get these younger audiences, because they're showing up for The Nun 2, right? That's a great example of how the younger audiences, the horror audiences, show up in a very specific amount of numbers, right? They don't make, we're not talking about, massive Marvel MCU type crowds here, but it is strong enough to where if you have that, $15 to $40 million budgeted movie, you're able to make quite a bit of cash and quite a bit of profits because of that guaranteed audience. Haunting in Venice tried to capture that, because ultimately when you talk about Agatha Christie adaptations, when you talk about anything that's going to be adapted by Kenneth Branagh, typically it's going to appeal to an older demographic, and that older demographic has not been nearly as consistent, especially since the COVID time started. And so you're looking at these numbers and thinking, okay, they went for that gamble of marketing it towards younger kids with the horror trailers, and again, that's something that actually turned me off to it, because I was like, oh, maybe this could be more interesting, but because it tried to hit a little bit too much with the horror vibes on it, it just made me not interested in seeing it. And I think that probably is going to be the impact on especially some of the older audiences and older demographics as well. The question is, how much of the younger audience did it get? Based on these numbers, it's not looking like it got a whole lot of them. So it was a gamble, and I can understand the logic behind it, but they may have actually pushed more people away than people actually getting brought into the process. So we'll have to wait and see if there's any reports out about the demographics going to see the movie. I know that there's one site that I typically use that can kind of showcase that, but we'll have to wait and see if those numbers come out and what we can actually kind of gauge from that when those numbers do, if they ever come out, when they do. So also we have to talk about here the Equalizer 3. So I'm very happy to see the film had a pretty strong hold for its third week. So did not have a great hold week 1 to week 2, had a pretty large drop off from its week 1 to week 2, but 40% hold in its third week is definitely on a better trajectory there. It's definitely a better hold to have in this position. It's already starting to lose around 400 screens or so. So over be losing about 40% here is definitely not a terrible sign. $7.2 million means right now it's made about $73.6 million. So ultimately, we're talking here a chance. There's definitely a chance for the film to end its run around $100 million or so domestic. And the big question is going to be is how close does this get to the other films in the franchise, right? Each of the other films made somewhere between 190 and 200 million when you adjust for inflation. So that $200+ million range is kind of like the ceiling for this franchise. But it's looking like this film is actually pacing more towards maybe that 180, 190 possibly finish worldwide. But when you take into account how much higher ticket prices are today, the average ticket price is today compared to even just a few years ago, it's not even going to be close, right? The first two movies are clearly going to have sold more tickets than this one. And yeah, I can understand why, though, because the first film was really, really good. Second film, I thought was good up until the ending. And then the ending, it just kind of went way too CGI and just went way too silly. And I just couldn't get into it. I still really don't like the ending of 2. And then this one was just a nice one. This one, I thought they did a great job choosing the locations. And I thought that, once again, Denzel Washington brought it. That's the only reason why this franchise works. And I think that's its Achilles heel, because some people look at this film and say, look, I love Denzel, but I don't like anything else surrounding it. Like outside of him, I don't care. And I can understand why people would feel that way, right? I personally do enjoy a lot of the other elements, a lot of the other supporting characters and everything. I like the tie-ins that this film has to some of the previous movies too. But again, that I think is something because I'm much more influenced by the acting and the performance given by Denzel than maybe some other people might be. So that's why I understand anyone who doesn't like the film. But I am happy to see that it's definitely doing a little bit better here, at least this weekend, compared to other weekends. It's made around $130 million worldwide. So again, definitely not talking about a worst case scenario, but also still has a little ways to go. What is not looking that great, though, is My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 at $4.7 million. That's a 53% drop from week 1 to week 2. And no one saw this movie opening weekend. Still, no one is seeing the film. We don't have an actual budget for this film as a recording of this video. And so right now, all we can say is, if anything, it's going to make its money back, barely. And that's never a position that you ever want to be in, right? Same would be true for The Equalizer 3. Same would be true for any of the other films that, even I liked, right? If you're getting to that barely break-even number, it's not a good thing. It's not a good state to be in. And ultimately, it's got to be a huge loss for Focus Features because, again, they're kind of thinking back to the glory days of the first movie. For those that did not see the first film, it cost around $5 million to make, and then it ended up making over $350 million worldwide. It was this huge box office sensation. And when you talk about, return on investment, that is a massive return on investment. When you put in $5 million for budget, and then maybe an extra $2.5 to $5 million for the actual marketing for the marketing for the movie. Again, to get $350 million back, even after the split between the studios and the theaters, that's still a massive, massive return. Compare that to My Big Fat Greek Wedding 2 and 3, which costs 10 to 15, in this case, possibly even up to $18 million. They shot on location in Greece here. That is not a good place for them to be at 18.5 domestic and not making much else anywhere else. And so I don't really know the motivation. I don't know what the thought process was, oh, this time it'll be different. This time we'll get people back. Apparently that did not work. What is still working though is Barbie. Barbie is still in the top 5. 9 weeks out from its initial release, it is still rocking that top 5 slot. $3.9 million there, so close to $4 million still after 9 weeks. Still out at over 3,000 screens. And if you saw the little back and forth I had with someone on Twitter covering the box office, and in this case talking about Barbie, talking about it as being a top 12 all-time box office, I explained why, when you take into account the average ticket price over the years and you adjust for inflation, you realize, no, top 12 is really not a fair estimate here. It's doing very well. It's obviously still the number 1 film of this year, and I don't think anything else this year is going to be able to come close to beating it. Fact still remains is that it's not anywhere close to being the most impressive of the films that have gotten the number 1 spot in any given year. Especially compare this back to a film like Spider-Man No Way Home, and you're like, oh man, okay, you're talking still about an 80 million ticket difference between the two based on just general estimates, and that had even more impressive stuff because of the whole, again, very, very, very close to the whole COVID stuff. But still, Barbie doing very well. Very, very impressive numbers here. And there's really nothing else to say about that. Jawan, this is a film that I know I got some love on last weekend when I talked about this movie. They were happy that I mentioned it. So 2.4 million, so a 60% drop, but keep in mind, right, this is a Bollywood film, and so clearly there is going to be probably, the Indian audience here in the United States that is going to support it. And I know that when I worked at AMC, we did have already some showings of Bollywood films, and a lot of the Indian demographic in the city of New Orleans showed up for that performance. But I think that you're also starting to see, especially with films like RRR and with the previous films the last 5 years, probably more so than any of the others, they start to appeal out to Western audiences. And so I think you're seeing a lot more Western audiences, a lot more American audiences going to support and see these kinds of movies. And so, hey, kudos to them for being able to make a film that a lot of people are going out to support, having one of the best opening weekends in India. For an Indian, and again for a Bollywood film especially, and the fact that it's also doing pretty well here domestic in comparison to other films. Again, very happy to see that for them. The number 7 spot goes to Blue Beetle. Again, we're talking here about percentage-wise decent holds, but again, it's not adding much of anything. We're talking here about a film that's doing nothing during the week and is doing just a little bit more over the weekend. And so that's why you're seeing these holds not be nearly as terrible as what the film actually is, right? So this film still only at $67 million domestic, so still going to be a $100+ million flop for Warner Brothers. Gran Turismo also, unfortunately, is still not just doing much of anything, even though, again, dropping in the 30s after 4 weeks. Again, those percentages are not the worst in the world, but you have to always keep that in mind and compare that to the total box office it's made so far. So it's still just not going to be enough. Oppenheimer, now this is an exciting one because this film has right now made $318 million after 9 weeks, so still also performing very well, not nearly as much as Barbie, but still doing well, and it's doing especially well internationally. And in fact, this film has now officially crossed $900 million at the global box office. So very, very impressive numbers here. Question mark is, where does this film end up? Does this film get to $1 billion? Does this film eke out 950, right? I think right now the tracking is indicating that 950 seems like a possible and a possible likely outcome for the film, which, just if you think about it, Oppenheimer, 3-hour Christopher Nolan, in parts black and white, but still a 3-hour drama, making the same amount of money potentially as Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. Like, at least in the ballpark. That to me is just such an insane concept of just how well this film is doing. Even though I was not the biggest fan of it, I had a lot of issues. I thought it was quite pretentious with the way it was shot and filmed without having really any justified reason for filming in the way that it did, in addition to just the completely unnecessary, gratuitous, sex scenes that were in the film. Luckily, it wasn't a whole lot of it, but still, it's like, really? Why are you putting that in there, Nolan? But still, $900 million, very impressive, and that means that 600 or so million is coming internationally there, so very, very impressive. Do I think it's going to get to $1 billion? I don't think it'll have enough gas in the tank. I don't think it's going to have any other countries it can open in to boost it up to that level, but hey, never say never in today's box office market. Rounding off the top 10 is TMNT. Mutant Mayhem at 28% of a drop there. So again, still doing pretty well, and it's getting very close to its break even. So even though this film early on was not indicating that it was going to hit that number, it looks like it actually has a chance of doing so over the course of the next couple of weeks. Before going into the actual chart itself, I did want to mention once again the Mission Impossible news, because with that $71 million payout from Paramount, what that means is that the film right now is sitting around somewhere between like 95 million and maybe 120 million in actual box office losses. Guess what? That cuts that number more than half, and that ultimately means that they're in a much better position when the part 2 comes out, right? Because the speculation is, okay, they spent a lot of money on this one because, right, $71 million, they obviously were probably wanting a bit more, right? There was a $100 million limit policy that they had on this, that Paramount had on this movie. Because of the delays, they were expecting to get upwards of close to $100 million. My guess is that that's what they were expecting. The fact, though, that they got $71 million, that's a huge portion of it, right? That's over 70% of what the maximum, the limit rather, was for the payout there. So I think that they're going to be very, very happy with that because, again, that actually makes quite a bit of a difference. And we'll talk about just how much of a difference when we get into the charting, which we'll go ahead and get into now. Actually, first off, let's just do, again, $158 million for The Nun 2 worldwide. Haunting in Venice only at 37.2. And again, this film costing $60 million, this film costing $38 million. You see that is ultimately what makes a huge difference there. Equalizer 3 at 132. The overall range for this franchise is around 190 plus. So again, it's looking like it might make the similar amount of money, or at the very least in the range of the previous films, but average ticket price today a lot higher than what it was back even just a few years ago with the last film, and then the first film, of course, several years before that. Going to the box office chart, we love doing charting here over at OMB Reviews. First, talking about Haunting in Venice. So because the film cost $60 million, it means that the break even roughly $150 million. So I think you'll have some people estimate that it's going to be $150 million break even. For some, you might even have it upwards of $200 million as far as this break even is concerned. And if you take that into account, at 37.2, right now it's around $67 million in the red. Remember that most films, right, in their opening weekends, if you compare their opening weekend worldwide to their end result, tend to make around a third of their box office on average. Again, this is an average number here. About a third of the entire box office is made in a film's opening weekend on average. So if that average holds out, right, if Haunting in Venice has an average performance compared to other films historically, that means the film will end somewhere around the $90 to $120 million range. Now, because of that, what that means is that, yeah, this film's not going to break even. This film's going to end up being a loss. Now, not the biggest loss in the world because the budget is not as high as, say, a movie like The Flash or anything like that, but still a financial loss nonetheless. And it looks like the gamble they made of trying to market this film towards younger audiences probably won't end up, panning out in the end. The Nun 2, we also can make some projections on this film because we have the week 2 numbers there. So at $158 million, I'm projecting based off of historical data that the most likely scenario is that it ends somewhere between 226 and 317 million. So still expect this film to have some pretty heavy drop-offs just because, again, most people want to see films like this in their opening weekend or in their second weekend. So we'll probably have another pretty big drop by next weekend if I had to guess. But ultimately, I still do think that between 226 and 317 is very likely. Now, because of that $38.5 million budget, the break even being roughly around $100 million, right now I'm projecting the film to get somewhere between $78 and $132 million in net gain profits. So, hey, Warner Brothers, once again, actually has a film making some money. I still don't quite think that even this and Barbie, and again, they get probably close to half of the total profits from Barbie. So you're still talking about them getting 300 plus million from Barbie when everything is said and done. Add another 100 million or so to that because of The Nun 2. Guess what? I don't think that's still going to be enough to make up the difference of how much money they are losing on films like The Flash and also like Blue Beetle and also like I'm losing it right here as far as the actual name is concerned because of just how little impact it actually had on the box office, but Shazam 2. So I think that you're just looking at a situation where, yeah, they're making some money on these movies, but because they lost so much early on, I don't think they're going to have enough to make it back, but we'll talk about that when we actually get to that point, later in the year. My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3, again, now we can make some projection on this film, and as you can see, right now the budget is estimated around $18 million. We don't have an official word on that yet, so take that with a grain of salt, but based on the numbers that we currently have, it's going to lose somewhere between $6 million and possibly get upwards of $1.6 million in net gain profits. For a total worldwide number, for those interested, that would be somewhere between 34 and 47 million. So again, a far cry from the $350 million of the first film. And this would even be a far cry from the $90 million made by the second film. Both of those numbers, by the way, unadjusted for inflation. So yeah, this movie is just dead in the water. It just does not really have a chance in the world of doing much of anything. So yeah, it might be able to break even because of just how little money it likely cost. It still cost enough though, and just not enough people are going to see the actual film. Equalizer 3 at $132 million. As you can see right now, only $25 million in the red. So just needs to get to 2.5 times its budget. It's at 1.9 right now. So it's still possible, right? This film still has a chance of being able to get to that 175 number. I do think 175 is a very likely endpoint for this movie. Probably getting somewhere in the 180s, maybe low 190s. We'll have to wait and see exactly where things go, but I do think that Equalizer 3 will do fine on paper, but when you compare it to the other films of the franchise and you take into account that the ticket price today versus ticket price for the other two films is, several dollars difference, you're still looking at a franchise that has gone down quite a bit. I don't know if they do an Equalizer 4. I don't think they need to, but again, that's kind of just the numbers as they currently are right now. Gran Turismo is now at around $102 million worldwide, so we knew that it was going to get to that $100 million worldwide. It needs to get to 150 to be able to break even, at the very least, at the bare minimum. And so is it possible? It's possible, but it's got a lot of ways to go. Remember that most of the money was made internationally early on, so you're going to start to see that international number slow down quite a bit, if I had to guess, unless it's going to open in other countries that are going to go gaga for it, which I just don't at this point see happening. But hey, again, you never know. Right now, though, not looking too great for the film, but definitely not going to be one of the bigger losers of the year. That is led to films like the Blue Beetle movie, right? $117 million worldwide as of the recording of this video. So as you can see, it's having a pretty average performance there, right? Right now, compared to its first 2 weeks, or its first 2 weeks compared to its total right now, it's around 69, so around 70% of its box office. So it's looking like it'll probably end around an average performing, so maybe somewhere between 1 and 1.5 times its budget. Still, that's going to be about a $100+ million loss for the Blue Beetle film, and therefore for Warner Brothers. Strays also continuing to be a box office flop, even though it is actually doubling what it's made so far. After its total right now is double what it made, more than double what it made in the first 2 weeks of release. So, hey, kudos to them on that front, but still not enough to make up for the budget that was just a little bit too high for a movie like that. Last Voyage of the Demeter at $20 million is still a flop. The Meg 2 has, again, we are still seeing the film in that positive category, but just remember that when you remember that the vast majority of this money is still coming from China, and they only get 25% of the receipts on that, it just means, yeah, this is a bit of a fool's gold number here. So they might be financially okay, but they're just definitely not making a lot of money off of this movie based off of, the metrics that we currently have available to us. TMNT is getting very close to its break even, so it very well could get to that point. I did mention early on that the early projections did show, right, historically, that chance of making money is still on the table. But based on the numbers, it didn't seem like it was really holding strong enough to be able to get to that point. As of right now, it's performing a lot better than it was early on, so it's still possible to end its run in the black, but just remember that it really doesn't need to because of all the sales of merchandise for TMNT stuff, which apparently is quite high this year. Talk to Me also still, Talk to Me was that horror film that was able to motivate a lot of people to go see it. Again, very, very low budgeted film, and so has been able to add to its budget. As you can see, very impressive compared to the first 2 weeks, 14.3 times its budget. That's what happens when you make a lower budgeted film. If they had been able to do that with A Haunting in Venice, you probably could have seen the film do a lot better, but that's just not what they do these days. The Barbie film at $1.407 billion. So right now, it's not looking like the international numbers are actually going to be able to push the film that much further. I think that because it's now on demand, I was expecting to see it be a little bit higher. And again, that is as of the recording of this video. Let me go ahead and see if any updates have happened according to the numbers.com. That's still $1.4 billion. So if there are any updates, I'll let y'all know. But based off of that, compared to what was previously, yeah, I don't know if it's going to have enough gas to get to the Top Gun Maverick numbers there. Again, theoretically, it's still possible on paper based off of the numbers that we're seeing, but it's looking like that the fact that it is now available on PVOD, meaning that you can buy it on streaming, I think that that is definitely going to slow it down and probably going to slow it down internationally too, it seems, which I thought had a chance of not happening to the same extent. But it looks like that's not playing out the way that I thought. And so, again, looking like this film will still be the highest grossing film of the year. But as I mentioned in the stream that I did last night, definitely not going to be the most impressive or one of the most impressive movies of the last 20, 30 years as far as number one films of a year are concerned. Oppenheimer at $912.7 million. Again, the question is, does it get to $1 billion? I don't think. 950 seems very likely to me. Still, doesn't matter really what it goes to because it's still, more than double what it made in the first 2 weeks. So very impressive there. So this is a chart breaker in every single way. 9.1 times its reported budget. Very, very impressive. We're talking about close to $400 million in net gain profits. Now, this is, of course, based off of the $100 million budget that was given to us. I still don't quite trust that number based off of what I know about how Nolan made that movie, but again, those are the numbers as they were given to us. All right, now the last thing I'll talk about here is Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Ooh, man, that number. So this film still very much not performing in the way that anyone would have expected. Paramount obviously wanted this film to do a lot better. I wanted this film to do better because it's just a good movie, and I'm actually quite surprised that it performed this poorly. And again, I think a lot of it ultimately comes down to the way in which they released the film. I think that they just chose some of the worst dates to release it and just some of the worst timing in the world. And because of that, I think that it probably left a lot of money on the table. But here is the big benefit, or here is the big positive, you could say, when it comes to Paramount, because at $566 million, you then have to take into account the fact that this movie, right, got $71 to $75 million back from this insurance company. So again, just taking it the simplest way possible, if you talk about that in comparison to the projected losses, we're talking about a $95+ million loss now being closer to a $20 million loss. So still not good. I don't think Paramount or Tom Cruise or anyone wants the film to be in that scenario, but the fact still remains is that this movie is definitely been thrown a lifeline, and I think that we can walk away from this saying Mission Impossible is definitely going to be able to make its money back in post-theatrical with Blu-rays and with 4Ks and also with any streaming rights that they're going to sell, especially internationally. And so they'll be in a decent position. It's still not great. It's still a box office failure, but let's just say it was going into it being potentially one of the big box office failures of the summer. And yet now it's not going to be in that category or even be close to being one of the top, losers of the year, right? That still is going to be left with films like Indiana Jones, Dial of Destiny, right? Which is an estimated $370 million loss, or the $280+ million projected loss for The Flash. We'll find out more information about those movies when we get some of those tax returns next year from the UK. But just wanted to give an update on Mission Impossible there to say, yes, this film still a box office flop, but still $70+ million returns, extra money that you just get because of a lawsuit. That's a huge win for them, and that's going to definitely put them in a much better financial situation getting ready for part 2. But those are the numbers as they stand. What are y'all's thoughts? Are you surprised to see that Mission Impossible was able to get a little bit of money back there? Let me know your thoughts on that. Also, your thoughts on Haunting in Venice, The Nun 2. Let me know your thoughts on any of those things. And before I go, I want to give a shout out to, this is not a sponsor, by the way. I found out this site, Cricket List. So this, Critic List, I keep saying Cricket. Critic List. So this is an app and a site that I just discovered because of the Salty Nerd podcast. Shout out to the Salty Nerds themselves. And it was something that I was already in the process of looking for an alternative movie review, TV review site, something that maybe even had dates on it. And all of a sudden I got this recommendation from the Discord of the Salty Nerds. And I saw this and I thought, this looks really, really cool. So I talked about this a bit on last night's stream if you want a fuller explanation of what it is and also of the different features with it. But I'm really, really digging this right now. It's got a very cool retro theme going for it. And I've already been in contact on this platform platform with the creators, and they've got a lot of really great ideas in the process. So I've already got some lists about films that I want to see. I've got my all-time top films of, top all-time films, at least for my own list. I've got some reviews out too. I got a general review for Only Murders in the Building, a TV show, which I think is most excellent. And yes, you saw that correct. That is how they do their five-star ratings, is that a 5-star is a most excellent score. A 3-star is a decent score. Then you have a heinous score, which is the 1-star review. And then you have a bogus score, which is the 2-star review. The 4-star review is listed as rad. So I got a ton of reviews of different films going on over there, and a couple of TV shows too. So if you want to follow me and you want to have a lot of fun with some really cool, retro themes and retro vibes as well, go check that out. It's a lot of fun. Barely anyone's on this platform, and so if you want to follow me over there, it's at OMB Reviews, and you can see I am listed as Templar Odin. So check it out, criticlist.com. There is an Android app and there is an iOS app. So if you follow me, leave a comment and start reviewing some movies, and I'll try and check those out, like them, and comment on them if I possibly can. So anyway, that's going to be it for me today, everybody. Also, remember, I probably won't have a box office breakdown on this channel for probably a couple weeks. My baby girl is coming, so she is going to be born probably sometime on Friday, so next weekend is definitely out of the picture, and I don't know exactly how long it'll take for us to get into a rhythm and rhyme. We'll have a newborn in the house. We'll have our toddler, baby Thor, still in the house too, so who knows what will happen. Just keep in mind, if you are wondering where the box office videos are or where the streams are, that is going to be why. So anyway, thank y'all for understanding and for all the love and support I've gotten from y'all. I've gotten a lot of comments of thoughts and prayers for my wife, for the Lady Freya, and also, of course, for our baby girl who's on the way, and for baby Thor as well. So thank you all again for those things. But that's going to be it for me. I talked way too much already. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members: Father Luca Illich, Laura, the Mother Major General's Story, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel by the name Eagle Rider. Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. Also to Matt317, check out his Twitch channel of the same name. Mr. Roy and ZK-Man, check him out over at xtheboundaries.co. Thank you very much for being my chosen members this month, and if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, also access to a podcast, access to a giveaways channel, and tons of other stuff, go check out to be a member today in the links in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.